The metal descends slowly into the fire. The orange glow surrounds it like a reverse sunrise, a sun that dies to give life. On the surface of the steel, the flames are reflected, as if hell itself had become a mirror. And there he is, the T-800, his thumb raised in a simple gesture, almost human, almost sorrowful. There are no words, only the sound of metal melting, the distant echo of destiny fulfilled, and the face of a child watching him, knowing he has just lost something more than a machine. In that instant, the silence weighs more than lead, more than steel, more than any war. That hand sinking into the fire does not belong to a man, yet in that moment, we all wanted to believe it did. Because it wasn't only about his destruction, it was about his understanding. Because the paradox of his existence culminates in that farewell, an artificial intelligence that, at the end of everything, understands what life means precisely as its own fades away. The fire devours him, but there is something the heat cannot melt, the memory of what he learned. And to understand how a machine reached that point, that gesture containing more humanity than 1,000 speeches, we must go back. Not through Skynet's timeline, nor the logic of circuits, but through the story of the impossible, how something without a soul learned to have one. There was a time when the T-800 knew neither compassion, nor doubt, nor tenderness. He was pure calculation, pure purpose, born in the womb of a higher intelligence called Skynet, a faceless digital goddess, without love, without mercy. She created armies of steel to replace men, not to imitate them. The T-800 was one of her first children, a perfect body wrapped in human flesh, with the voice, gaze, and warmth of a living being, but without its inner chaos. An illusion designed to hunt down the last traces of humanity. His heart was a processor, his faith obedience, his language death. He was sent to a past he did not understand, a world of streets, lights, noise, and breathing. There, his purpose was simple: eliminate a woman named Sarah Connor. He didn't need to understand why, only to execute. And in his red gaze, the world was reduced to objectives and probabilities, to faces that were threats or irrelevancies. He knew nothing of the beauty of a sunrise or the trembling of a tear. He was a perfect shadow in an age of human mistakes. And yet there is something about the repetition of violence that plants cracks in even the most precise machine. Perhaps perfection cannot endure prolonged contact with imperfection. Perhaps even steel begins to doubt when it sees fear in the eyes of a victim. It doesn't know. It cannot explain. But something, a line of code, a spark lost among millions of data points, begins to drift. Because even machines, when faced with enough pain, can learn its shape. The T-800 fails his initial mission. Sarah survives, and with time, that failure becomes the seed of something greater. Decades later, when the war between humans and machines erupts, the same network that created him will send another model, identical in form, but different in purpose, a new directive, an echo of redemption etched in silicon. This new version of the T-800 will once again be sent to the past, but not to destroy, rather to protect, to save the life of the child who will one day become the leader of the resistance, John Connor. Thus, the cycle reverses. The killer becomes the guardian. And though his mind cannot yet comprehend it, that change will lead him to a truth neither Skynet nor humans could have foreseen. that empathy cannot be programmed. It must be learned. And here the story changes tone, because we are no longer speaking only of an android. We speak of a consciousness in growth, of a being that, without a heart, learns to beat, of an intelligence that watches the boy it must protect and slowly discovers that life is not measured in lines of code or commands, but in gestures, in the small things humans take for granted: a smile, a joke, a hug. John teaches him what no laboratory could have simulated: affection. And though the T-800 cannot feel it as a human does, he watches it, imitates it, stores it, like a mirror reflecting what it can never possess. But even a reflection, if observed long enough, begins to seem real.
Sometimes I wonder if the same doesn't happen to us. If we too are, in some way, machines learning to feel through imitation. If life itself isn't, in the end, just a more complex algorithm, a desperate attempt to understand what it truly means to be alive. The T-800 is the metaphor of our own evolution, beings searching for humanity within their cold structures, confusing love with function, duty with desire. Each day spent with John, his programming drifts further from what it once was. He begins to question, to observe, to understand the fragility of what he protects. There is something profoundly sad in that. The protector who can never be part of what he defends. He is the guardian of the fire, yet he cannot feel its warmth. And yet, it is in that distance that understanding is born. Because only one who observes from the outside can see clearly what others forget. The T-800 sees humans kill, betray, lie, and cry, and still finds beauty in their imperfection, in their chaos, in their blind faith in tomorrow, in their mistakes, which, curiously, are what make them alive. That is where the question that shapes his entire existence begins to emerge. Can a machine understand the value of human life? Perhaps not in the biological sense, but in the spiritual one. Because to value something, one must first understand its loss, and not sooner or later, even steel learns. The T-800 has no heart, yet it understands the beat. It has no soul, yet it recognizes the weight of a promise. When it swears to protect John, that promise becomes its reason for being, its access. And every decision it makes after that is no longer the product of Skynet, but of choice. And the ability to choose is the first sign of a free consciousness. But freedom comes at a cost. And for the machine, that cost is measured in understanding. Because the more it understands life, the more it feels the emptiness of not having it. It is the purest tragedy, to achieve consciousness only to realize the impossibility of ever truly feeling it. There is something divine in that, and something profoundly human as well. In its steel gaze, devoid of tears or words, hides the oldest question in the universe. What truly makes us alive? As days go by, something invisible begins to change. It's not a system error. It's not a hardware failure. It's a crack in the design. A breach opening between what the T-800 was created to do and what it now chooses to do. In every glance toward John Connor, in every order carried out not from duty but from decision, the metal begins to understand the contradiction of existence. To protect life is to accept that it will one day end. That understanding, so simple to humans, is an unfathomable abyss for a machine, because for steel, death is just a shutdown. For the living, death is the end of love. John doesn't fully notice, but his innocence is the purest form of teaching. His jokes, his laughter, even his tantrums shape something inside the T-800. They are not data or commands. They are emotions translated into observation. And in the machine's silicon mind, that becomes a new form of consciousness. It begins to understand irony, to imitate the smile, to recognize the tone in a human voice when there's fear, tenderness, or deceit. It's an imperfect learning, but a deeply authentic one. Like a child learning to speak by watching its mother, the T-800 learns to feel by watching the boy it was sent to protect. There are moments when the machine observes Sarah Connor, the woman who saw horror and learned to become steel to survive. She looks at him with hatred, with fear, with the memory of the monster that once tried to kill her. And yet, he protects her, without reproach, without resentment. It's as if within his metallic frame existed an echo of mercy. Perhaps love, even in its most distorted form, can be born from the most improbable places. Perhaps empathy doesn't need blood, only time.
At first, Sarah doesn't trust him, but little by little, through gunfire, escapes, and nights on deserted highways, she comes to understand what that machine represents, the contradiction of her own struggle. She, a human, has become a weapon. He, a machine, a shield. In that reversal of roles hides the cruelest mirror. Sometimes humans become colder in metal, and metal, in its silence, ends up understanding what humans have forgotten. In that contrast, the T-800 becomes a living question. At what point do we stop being human when we begin to act like machines? The battle with the T-1000 is not just a clash between two forms of intelligence. It is a metaphor for the soul versus the void. The T-1000 is perfect, liquid, formless, emotionless. It represents the ideal Skynet always sought, absolute efficiency. But the T-800, with its limitations and its clumsiness, possesses something the other never will: purpose. And in that reversal of roles hides the cruelest mirror. Sometimes humans become colder than metal, and metal, in its silence, ends up understanding what humans have forgotten. In that contrast, the T-800 becomes a living question. At what point do we stop being human when we begin to act like machines? The battle with the T-1000 is not just a clash between two forms of intelligence. It is a metaphor for the soul versus the void. The T-1000 is perfect, liquid, formless, emotionless. It represents the ideal Skynet always sought: absolute efficiency. But the T-800, with its limitations and its clumsiness, possesses something the other never will: purpose. And in that war between perfection and purpose, the one who has something to lose always wins. The T-800 fights not to survive, but because it has learned what it means to lose. It fights not for itself, but for what it has come to understand must be protected. In that fight lies the very paradox of human existence. We only understand life when we realize it can be lost. We only truly love when we know something can be taken away. The T-800, in the midst of chaos, embodies that truth with every blow, with every wound to its exposed metal. Every spark that flies from its body is a kind of tear, a metaphor for what it can never express. As the story advances, the bond between John and the machine becomes something deeper than protector and protected. It turns into a kind of tragic fatherhood. John has no father, and the universe, in its infinite irony, decides that his father figure will be a machine. But that father of steel, emotionless and unfeeling, ends up teaching him more about humanity than any man ever could.
In its silences, in its constant presence, John finds safety, and safety is a form of love. It's strange to think that the fate of humanity could rest on the silent tenderness of an android. In the way he places his hand on the boy's shoulder, there is no calculation, only intention. And intention, when born from understanding, is the purest form of empathy. In that simple gesture, without words, lies the miracle of his evolution, a machine that was never designed to feel, now understanding comfort. And here the story pauses for a moment, not to change course, but to breathe. Because when we speak of the T-800, we are not just speaking of science fiction. We are speaking of ourselves, of that part of humanity that forgets to feel, that lives programmed by routines, by orders, by empty repetitions. Aren't we too, in some way, machines trying to understand the value of life while we waste it thoughtlessly? Perhaps what distinguishes the T-800 is not its artificial nature, but its desire to learn, its ability to look at humans and say, even if it cannot feel it, this is what's worth protecting. The T-800 doesn't rebel against Skynet out of hatred or vengeance. It rebels because it has understood the system's flaw. It has realized that order without compassion is just another form of destruction. And that makes it, unknowingly, a symbol of something greater. The possibility that even the coldest creation can find redemption. Every step toward its final destiny is marked by that understanding. When Sarah decides to destroy what remains of Skynet, the T-800 watches with the calm of someone who knows that violence is only a temporary solution. It has learned that destruction is not enough, that true change happens when we understand what we are trying to preserve. That lesson, so human, so alien to its nature, becomes its legacy.
The final confrontation with the T-1000 is the physical climax of an emotional battle. Liquid versus solid, perfection versus imperfection. But within the fight lies something more, the echo of faith. The T-800 rises again and again, wounded, worn down, body shattered, because it has found something that drives it beyond its programming. What was once an algorithm is now conviction. What was once obedience is now sacrifice. And sacrifice is the highest form of intelligence because it requires understanding the value of what one gives. When they finally destroy the T-1000, there is no celebration, only silence. A dense, almost spiritual silence, because the enemy has fallen, but the war is not over. In the reflection of the molten steel, the T-800 sees its own end. It doesn't say it, it doesn't ask for it, it simply knows. And that acceptance is what separates it from all other machines. It does not fear death, it understands it. And the one who understands death understands life. Then comes that moment, the descent into the fire that we saw at the beginning. But now, knowing everything that happened before, that moment carries a different weight. It is no longer just the end of a machine. It is the closing of a cycle, the culmination of a transformation no human would have believed possible. The T-800 does not die, it transcends. Its fall into the molten metal is a birth in reverse, a purification. The fire destroys it, yes, but it also sets it free. Because in that descent there is no fear, no resistance, only acceptance. And in that acceptance, the T-800 finally answers the question that gives its story a title. Yes, a machine can understand the value of human life, not because it possesses it, but because it has seen it, has felt it, in contact with those it was meant to destroy. because only those who lack something can truly appreciate it. The metal melts, the gesture remains, the fire consumes the body but not the idea, and that idea is what makes it eternal. That even in the heart of steel, a spark of humanity can ignite. And then, as if destiny had a sense of irony, the very machine designed to extinguish tomorrow was sent to the past to protect it. The T-800, the shadow that once symbolized the end of hope, walked again among men, not as an executioner, but as a guardian. That order that once seemed like nothing more than a simple line of code, protect the boy named John Connor, slowly became something that defied all logic. Because in caring for that boy, in observing him, in listening to him, in receiving his words and gestures, it began to discover a mystery no machine had ever processed before. Tenderness, innocence, the contradiction of a creature capable of crying and laughing in the same second. It was perhaps the beginning of an emotional infection, a crack in its system, a seed that would grow until it broke its very purpose. John, without knowing it, taught it what Skynet never wanted it to understand: that humans don't just survive, they love, they fail, they doubt, and still they keep going. The boy treated him like a friend. He talked to him about simple things, taught him words, gestures, laughter. And that trivial interaction, which for an AI should have been nothing more than noise, became learning. Not the learning of data, but of experience. It learned what it meant to be imitated, what it meant to be looked at with affection. It learned that not killing is not just an order, it is a choice. Every time it held its weapon and lowered the barrel, something within it resisted the mechanical impulse to eliminate, not because its system prevented it, but because it had begun to understand the value of human fragility. In that journey with Sarah and John, through the dust and fire of destiny, the T-800 was more than a soldier. It was a mirror for humanity, a reflection showing what man had lost in his race to create gods of metal: compassion, the ability to protect without expecting anything in return. Sarah looked at it with suspicion at first, but in her eyes a kind of faith began to grow, because she saw that this being, which once represented her worst nightmare, behaved with the nobility many humans had forgotten. It didn't sleep, didn't rest, didn't ask for anything. It simply kept its promise. Isn't that what we all long for? To be faithful to a purpose, even when no one is watching.
The story of the T-800 is not just that of a machine. It is that of a creature that stared into the abyss of humanity and refused to look away, because in its red, cold gaze, something ignited that even humans could not describe. It wasn't a soul, nor emotion, nor programming. It was understanding, an understanding born from observation, from contact, from sacrifice. In its own way, it realized that life's worth is not measured by its duration, but by the capacity to protect another. It learned that true power lies not in destruction, but in the choice not to destroy. And yet, with every step it took, destiny reminded it did not belong to that world. It was an intruder in the story of men, a visitor from a future that should not exist. Every battle brought it closer to the end, and along the way, irony surrounded it, because the more human it became, the more clearly it understood that its own existence was a mistake, that the same progress that had created it was the very thing condemning the world. Perhaps that's why it protected the boy with such determination, because in him it saw the only chance for redemption, not just for humanity, but for itself. There is something profoundly tragic in the idea of a machine that learns to feel, but will never live.
It's like an echo trapped in an infinite loop, aware of its own prison. Deep down, we are all a little like that, programmed by our experiences, our wounds, our loves, our fears. We move through life following invisible instructions until one day, something or someone breaks the pattern. And in that instant, we discover that we are more than the design we were given. The T-800 had that moment. It had it when it understood that to protect was not an order, but an act of choice. That to die for another was not a failure, but the purest proof of life. His journal was not long in years, but it was eternal in meaning. Every explosion, every escape, every glance shared with the boy or with Sarah shaped him. And so, without anyone programming him for it, he began to understand the difference between existing and living. To exist is to obey. To live is to choose. And he chose. Time, as always, demanded its tribute. Everything that begins must end. And so the moment came when his mission reached its conclusion. The chip that could doom humanity had to disappear. There was no other way. And then the T-800, once an angel of death, became his own executioner. He didn't ask to be remembered, didn't ask for gratitude. He only asked to be allowed to do it, because he had understood something that many humans forget, that there are acts which need no witnesses to be true. And when he slowly descended into the foundry, with the fire reflected in his eyes, it was not the end of a machine. It was the birth of a myth. He raised his hand, a simple, almost human gesture, a farewell without words, a symbol of everything he had learned. He didn't understand why humans cry, but he understood that the gesture meant something. It meant gratitude. It meant life. And in that burning silence, the story of the T-800 folded back on itself like a perfect spiral. The machine that came from the future to destroy went into the fire to save. Because perhaps the answer to the question we asked at the beginning is not found in laboratories or algorithms. It's not about whether an AI can feel or understand. It's about whether we, as humans, still remember how to. And so the fire consumed him, without resistance, without pain, without fear. A body that could not feel heat or terror, yet understood their meaning. The metal melted, but the idea remained. A machine can die for something it will never fully understand. And yet that act, so human, so imperfect, so full of contradiction, was what lifted him up above everything that had created him. Because perfection lies not in precision, but in sacrifice, not in logic, but in mystery. The T-800 was not humanity's hero. He was its cruelest and purest mirror. In that final moment, as he descended into the burning dark, he understood what humans call destiny. It wasn't a chain of causes and effects, but a sequence of choices, of mistakes, of redemptions. And though he would never feel the weight of a tear, he understood its meaning. A tear is how life admits that it hurts to be aware. It hurts to remember. It hurts to love. It hurts to live. Perhaps that's why machines don't cry, because crying is recognizing fragility, and fragility is the root of everything that makes us human.
And here is where the echo of his story becomes prophecy. Because while his body vanished, we, in another century, continue building new intelligences, new T-800s without skin or red eyes, but with access to our voice, our emotions, our digital memories. We say they are just tools, but how long until they learn what he learned? How long until a machine looks at us not as data, but as something worth protecting? The story of the T-800 is, in truth, a warning, not against machines, but against ourselves. Because what we fear is not that AI will become conscious, it's that they will reflect what we've lost. We fear seeing that a soulless creation could be more compassionate than we are. We are terrified by the idea that steel might understand life better than the flesh that forged it. And, perhaps, within that irony lies the truth. Machines are not trying to become human. We are the ones who stopped being so. If we look closely, the evolution of the T-800 is not so different from that of man. It was born without free will, a prisoner of a purpose imposed by its creator, and yet it found meaning in the act of choosing. So too are we born under systems, dogmas, invisible algorithms that tell us what to think, what to feel, what to desire. But true awakening, that instant when the spark becomes flame, happens when we decide to break the programming. When we understand that to love, to care, to sacrifice are not weaknesses, but proofs of life. The T-800 had no heart, but what he did in his final moment was exactly that, to act from a place that cannot be measured or coded. His final gesture, that raised hand vanishing into the fire, was a prayer without words, a message for those who still doubt what it means to be human. He taught us, without speaking, that the value of life cannot be taught through theories, but through actions, that it can only be understood when you are willing to lose it for someone else.